Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Nicole Hollins, and I am excited to have the privilege to present on a topic that I am extremely passionate about. Just as a little background for me, I received my PhD in psychology and behavior analysis from Western Michigan University under the advisement of Dr. Stephanie Peterson. Today, I will be presenting on really accumulation of my research, not only within my graduate school training, but also in my current clinical and research endeavors. So the title of the talk today is Free Appropriate Public Education for All Students, the role of behavior analysts in public schools. Before we jump into really the heavy content of today, I want to first share a resource that has been extremely valuable to me, not only as a professional, as a researcher, but also as a human when looking at the scope of applied behavior analysis and how we can continue to push the needle forward towards providing compassionate and culturally responsive services. So the title of this book is A Scientific Framework for Compassion and Social Justice. And I had the privilege to write a chapter in this book, and the content that I'll present on today is a direct reflection of the book chapter. Another thing that's really great about this book is that it really highlights how behavior analysts can provide compassionate services within safety, within the LGBTQIA plus community, and everything in between. So I highly recommend everyone to grab this book just as a resource. Now to dive into the content for today. So for free appropriate education for all students is something that we are all very privy to as behavior analysts that work in the public schools, even as Tier 1 interventionists in the public schools. Now, when looking at the regulations of IDEA and its legal protections for students with and without developmental disabilities, it's clear that there are exclusionary practices that persist within the schools, and it causes students both without disabilities, to be excluded from their education settings at a higher rate than their peers. And when we look into the data specifically for which group of people are really impacted by this, a lot of data indicate that African American children or Black students comprise of only 19% of the preschool population, and they make up 47% of all preschool suspensions. So when we think about the proportion, which is 47% out of 19%, that is a pretty large percentage of students that are expelled and suspended from their preschool setting. And when we also look at other demographics, such as gender, we see that boys are 4 times more likely to be expelled than girls, and 4-year-olds are 50% greater, or have a 50% greater chance to be expelled than 2 or 3-year-olds. So these data are very clear and indicates that there are some disproportionalities that are occurring in public schools. And when looking at those data, we have to take a step back and think, how does this impact students? So for students that are expelled and suspended because they are suspended from their primary setting, they are more likely to be removed from those critical learning opportunities. So if students are not in their classroom, they are probably not contacting the same level of instructional support and social skills as well. They also have an increased likelihood to drop out of school. So if a student has consistently experience expulsions and suspensions that then has significant long-term effects on their retention in schools, not only in the primary setting, but also when they progress towards secondary settings. And if students do drop out of school, that then impacts them as adults. So there is a decreased weekly income as adults, and increasingly, they are more than likely to be involved with the criminal justice system. And the most important point here to kind of highlight in how we can provide value as behavior analysts in the public schools is how the suspension and expulsion of students in the school, how that perpetuates negative teacher-student interactions throughout their academic career. Now, in early education settings, the time period and one of the most crucial times in the student's educational journey, not only through my personal beliefs, but also research shows that early education has a significant impact on students in general. So early education directly impacts the students' academic achievement, also their cognitive abilities, and this directly impacts their behavioral outcomes. Now, when looking at the data that indicate how students of color, students of different genders, and potentially even students with varying diagnoses, how they may experience the educational system in a different way, as behavior analysts and as tier one interventionists, it's important to determine how we can contribute to equitable education and to ensure that all students have free, appropriate public education. So there are two main areas in which behavior analysts can contribute. First includes the acknowledgement of and action to limit exclusionary practices. And secondly, behavior analysts can contribute by using effective evidence-based teaching practices. Let's first talk about how behavior analysts can contribute by the acknowledgement of and action to limit exclusionary practices in the public schools to ensure that all students receive a free, appropriate public education. So as I quickly displayed this image on the slide, we were probably immediately able to identify this word. So for those who are not able to visually see, the image that is displayed is a stop sign. And if we have a fluent repertoire in letter identification, letter sounds, and blending, as well as a history with knowing sight words, we were able to almost very automatically and quickly identify that this word and this stop sign says the letter stop. So when we look at how quickly behaviors may occur in the public schools, this serves as a really good example to see and to know that some of the behaviors that happen covertly or that happen within our mind, they happen very quickly, but these are still behaviors. And these behaviors then lend themselves to actions that may or may not disproportionately impact students in the public schools. So when referring to the quickness of these behaviors, some researchers have identified the behaviors as being implicit or implicit biases. And this refers to quickly, effortlessly, unintentionally, or behaving in a way that is difficult to control. So when these behaviors occur, they can happen very quickly. And in that time period, one may assume that it is an inherent structure. But when adapting a more behavioral approach in identifying biases, disproportionalities, and just ensuring that in supporting teachers in using equitable teaching practices, there are ways to address bias in the public schools by using a different lens. So bias can be conceptualized as a behavior phenomenon rather than a mental structure. So it is indeed something that people do rather than something that people possess. And if we are able to shift and make this transition from perceiving behaviors as that mental structure as opposed to an observable behavior, I believe there is avenue and there are ways for behavior analysts to take meaningful data on socially significant behaviors to ensure FAPE for all students. Now, in saying this, there are some difficulties, not only in measuring implicit bias, but also in really just having these conversations and knowing where to start. First, how implicit bias is defined. So again, as implicit bias is defined as that quick or automatic way of behaving that presents some challenges, especially for behavior analysts, as we are not able to read the minds of the teachers that we work with. Yet, through this definition, it shows that these behaviors do indeed occur. And it's challenging and it's important for behavior analysts to identify that how these behaviors may present across different teachers, different settings, and ultimately how that impacts the students. Also, even still in 2022, this is filmed in 2022, there is still an aversion to the discussion of racial biases, not only in the broader community, but also in our public school system. So even just this aversion to having these difficult conversations may present challenges for behavior analysts and other tier 1 interventionists when recording and taking data on these behaviors. Also, there may be a difficulty to have conversations about equity or implicit bias in the public schools. And one concept that is very prevalent, or that has been more prevalent, especially through the use of technology and social media, is this concept called warrior mentality. So Dr. Cody Morris and I recently published a paper on warrior mentality and in general risk factors to client mistreatment in applied settings. And this really highlights that mentality that some may embody when they encounter a difficult situation with a student or a client. So there may be, if you reflect on your scrolling behavior or different things that you've seen on social media, and if you work with children that engage in severe challenging behaviors, it's possible you may have seen someone post a picture of a bruise, or someone post a picture of a classroom that was destroyed. And within these modalities, people are displaying, that they encountered and they persevered through a very tough situation. And this concept really just embodies that warrior mentality practice. When looking at the literature and how other researchers have identified and taken data on these implicit biases, one study or one procedure that has been validated and empirically assessed is titled the Implicit Relational Assessment Procedure, or the IRAP for short. Now, this procedure was established and developed by Barnes and Holmes in 2010. And the entire purpose of the IRAP is essentially to determine if there are functional relations between a stimulus that is being presented and the latency between a specific response, and how that is either consistent or inconsistent with their learning history. So as an example, within an IRAP assessment, in this study, one may be interested in learning about implicit biases that may be present for employees. So displayed on the screen here in this example, that shows at the top, attractive employable, attractive unemployable, an image that is displayed, and then there are two keywords here, which is honest and dishonest. And between the time period in which the image is displayed and a participant selecting honest or dishonest, or I'm sorry, consistent or inconsistent, they are then able to determine some implicit biases that an individual may have to this particular gender and or this stimulus in general. So it's through these rapid presentations of different pictures and the descriptors, consistent or inconsistent, that one is able to determine if a bias is present. Now, for behavior analysts that work in the schools and for Tier 1 interventionists, there are some considerations when attempting to use the IRAP in schools. So first is that there may be a scarcity of the computer software resources for a district. Not only just given the post-pandemic era, but our schools are very much, resources are limited just in general, pre-2020 and post-2020. So in general, there is a lack of resources for the public schools. Also, there is limited understanding of statistical analysis results, even from someone, myself, who has taken multiple statistic courses. Statistics can be very challenging. And when trying to kind of translate stats into a digestible format for the teachers that I work with, that can just be very challenging and also a little intimidating. In schools, there may be some competing contingencies, and this includes the time cost as well as the financial cost. Also, as a behavior analyst that either is an employee of the school district or a behavior analyst that consults with the school district, there may be a potential inability for school-based practitioners to access the IRAP results. And it may be that using these data may inform their practices and their interventions for the teacher. And last but not least, I think one of the biggest considerations when looking at the utility of the IRAP is the interpretation of the analogous results from the IRAP and how it relates to current teaching practices. That is, a teacher or a behavior analyst, anyone may take the IRAP and receive those results. But there is limited data that shows how those results inform their teaching practices. As another example, for individuals that have taken any online test or a personality test, a love language test, those data may present some very interesting findings, and how those data impact behaviors is or may be limited. So this is also a consideration when attempting to use the IRAP in public schools. Now for the next component, effective teaching practices that are evidence-based. So within the classroom context, there are multiple layers in which supports should be provided from behavior analysts. And when looking at FAPE, or free appropriate public education, it's essential to determine the variables that impact not only the teacher's behavior, but also and ultimately the student's behavior. Now, the first variable that is important to analyze as a behavior analyst is looking at the environmental arrangement. Now, Dr. Charles Greenwood in 1988 proposed and developed this concept of an ecological behavior assessment. And it's essentially evaluating how the environment is arranged that will either produce desired behaviors and it may produce desired performances by the students. So ecological or the environmental arrangements or ecological behavior assessments really just means looking at the environment. So in this image here, there are several arrows that point to where the bookshelf is placed, where the carpet is for that group instruction, where other bookshelves are placed, as well as the table. So as behavior analysts, and when initially working in a public school or in a classroom, it's essential to first look at the environment to see how that it is supporting students. So this could be identifying that there is a clear pathway between one side of the classroom to another side of the classroom, which could be a runway for students. It may also be rearranging or kind of shifting a desk to ensure that the teacher is always able to actively supervise the students. So ensuring that the front of their desk is facing towards the students as opposed to their back facing towards the students, and many more variables. So it's important to look at the environment, how it is arranged, and work in collaboration with teachers and with other staff that support the classroom to determine how we can best rearrange the environment to ensure that we are setting students up for success. The next component is staff support or interpersonal relationships. So working with some adults can be pretty challenging, right? Training adults can be very challenging. And not only are our educators tasked with so much focused on the students, so providing their academic support, teaching them about social skills, being a therapist for the students, for the teacher, for the parents, teachers are tasked with so much. And it can also be challenging to not only have to manage 26 students, but also manage and support staff or paraeducators. So when looking at, a multi-level framework towards providing services in the public schools, interpersonal relationships are extremely important to analyze and also to provide guidance on. Now, there may be scenarios in which the expectations are unclear. There may be scenarios in which a parapro is constantly rotating. So there may be a new parapro or support staff every 2 to 3 months. There also just may be other challenging dynamics that are inherent within the building. But as behavior analysts and working and supporting teachers in the public schools, I think it's very valuable to have conversations with our teachers and ask them, how do you feel providing feedback to this staff member? Or are you comfortable in kind of determining what the expectations are for your support staff? There are many instances in where, at least I've worked with educators who this is their first time having a support staff, or they've never had to explicitly kind of coach and train their support staff on their classroom expectations. So having these very culturally humble and also just sensitive conversations, I think can provide an immense value, because when both teachers, when the lead teacher and the parapro are on the same page, that is extremely helpful in facilitating a positive classroom environment. Next is baseline classroom conditions. So Kessner, Peterson, Eldridge, and Peterson in 2018 developed and really systematized the foundation of classroom management or best classroom hygiene practices. So for those of you who are listening or for those who currently work in public schools, this may be a little bit intuitive, but I think that it is important to kind of identify what the pillars are in classroom management practices, as that serves as a good foundation for behavior analysts when working in the schools. Because there are several instances where a behavior analyst may be referred to work with one individual student. And in going into that classroom and looking at the student dynamic, the teacher dynamic, as well as the environmental dynamic, it's possible that supports may be needed not only just for the referred student, but also supports in general in the classroom. So baseline classroom conditions can be broken up into 4 main categories. The first one is rates of active student responding or choral responding. And this primarily happens during large group or small group settings. And the entire purpose of active student responding is to ensure that students are actively engaged with the lesson content. So in order to demonstrate that students are engaged with the lesson, they have to respond to instruction. That responding can look like raising a hand. It can look like vocally saying an answer out loud. It can also look like thumbs up, thumbs down. It can be rapidly presenting questions that are appropriate for the students to respond to. And by rapidly presenting active student responding and opportunities to respond, this increases the probability that students will be engaged in the classroom and be engaged with the lesson. It also decreases the probability that students will engage in challenging behaviors. It's best practice with active student responding to provide about 4 ASRs per minute. And this may seem a lot, but when we think about a phonetics lesson or we think about math facts, there are ways to present instruction in a way that is very explicit and also concise in a way that keeps students engaged with the lesson. The next area is appropriateness of curriculum. So as educators, as behavior analysts, we really have little to no impact on the curriculum or say so in the curriculum that is used within different schools. But when looking at the curriculum that is required, there are still ways to ensure that students are responding to the lesson materials correctly. So as an example, when presenting different lesson content, students should be responding correctly for approximately 80% of those learning opportunities, and about 20% of that content should be fairly new, or in turn, we would expect there to be about 20% of error. So while we are not able to modify the curriculum, that's beyond our scope, we are able to evaluate our teaching practices to ensure that students are responding correctly. So if, for example, we present on the theme of the week may be recycling, it's possible that students may not know different components of recycling. So instead of just continuing to move forward, knowing that students they haven't quite grasped that concept, we can modify the lesson content by presenting rapid active student responding and providing explicit feedback and reinforcement to shape up or scale up the students to respond in a correct manner. This leads to the next point as far as feedback and reinforcement. So the importance of behavior-specific praise and affirmations cannot be overstated. Across pre-K through 12th grade, it is critically important to provide frequent praise statements, acknowledgements, affirmations to students, as this really signals to the students that what they're doing is correct and what they're doing is spot on and they are meeting the classroom expectations. In the same manner, we also want to be ensure we're decreasing or using limited to no statements of disapprovals within our instruction. Because if we say instructions in a way that uses don't. So for example, don't run, don't hit your neighbor. If we use those don't behaviors, the last thing that we attend to is the word. So if we say don't run, run was the last word I heard, especially for our younger children. So it's important to state the exact behavior that you want to see. So instead of don't run, we can say walking feet. Or instead of don't hit your neighbor, we can say use quiet hands or use respectful hands. So there are ways to still state exactly what's wanted and what's expected in a positive and affirming way. And for the last component, thinking about our explicit instruction, this then fades in beautifully to transitions. So transitions can be a very hard time in schools, not only for our pre-K students, but also even in high school settings. During transitions, it's possible students may not be aware of the classroom expectations and also what the next activity is. So within this article, Kessner et al., they highlight the critical components of effective transitions, and they also provide a tool that has broken up each of these 4 pillars of baseline classroom conditions into a document that can be used across all education settings. And finally, taking that final look at our classroom practices, it's focused on bias-based behaviors, or specifically how a teacher may interact with one student and another student, and how those interactions may be variable based on history, based on attendance, based on race, gender, ethnicity, all of the above. So as behavior analysts when working in the public schools, it's essential to look at and evaluate how interactions may vary for different students in the classroom, and support teachers in having and reflecting and being more self-aware of their teaching practices, and really focusing on our baseline classroom conditions with an equity lens. So determining how effective are our instructions, not only to the AM group, but also to the PM group. What's the rate of our praise and affirmation statements towards this group of students versus that group of students? So it's really supporting teachers and ensuring that all students receive the free, appropriate public education, and also that our teaching practices are equitable across all students. Now, I say everything with a caveat in that navigating service provision is not easy, especially for behavior analysts in a consultative role in the public schools, or even as behavior analysts that are employees of the public school, of the district. It's very difficult to have these conversations. It's difficult to analyze behavior in that way. So when we look at those 4 components to evaluating those classroom management practices, those can be very tricky because every classroom is different, every teacher is different, every dynamic is different. So this is not easy, but I do believe that this is extremely valuable as supporting teachers and parapros in using evidence-based teaching practices, and also looking at and being more aware of their teaching practices can be extremely helpful, not only for their personal and professional development, but ultimately for the students that we serve and support. So thank you for the opportunity to talk about the role of behavior analysts when working in public schools to ensure free, appropriate public education. This is really grounded in the principles of EdB consultations, which focus on individualized services, transparent, as well as using evidence-based practices. Thank you so much for your time today, and I hope that you found the content very meaningful and applicable. If there are any questions or if you would like to talk or collaborate, I'd be more than happy to meet with you virtually. I have my contact information here on this last slide. And thank you so much, VDOE, for your time today.